Routing is the foundation of every application. In this video, we're going to learn how we handle routing in Next.js 13 using the app router. Let's get into this. Next.js 13 introduced the new app router, which is built on top of React Server components, which supports layouts, nested routing, suspense, streaming, error boundaries, and more. Now, the app router works inside of a directory named app in your project. This can coexist with the pages directory from Next.js 12. So if you're incrementally adapting to this new app router, if you're working with a Next.js application that's built on top of the pages directory, these two can coexist. It will be two apps and two routers running alongside each other. But obviously they shouldn't conflict in any path or any URLs or segments. So for example, if you have an about page inside of your pages directory, you cannot have the about page inside of the app, but you can incrementally or gradually move your pages to the app router if you are working with a current Next.js application. In this case, we're building this from scratch, so we're going to worry about the app router. So before talking about creating new routes, files, and folders inside this app folder, I want to talk about three concepts or terminologies that you're going to hear me out using throughout these modules. And those three are going to be your segments, route segments or URL segments, your path, and then the route segment. As you can see here, we have our domain on the left-hand side, example.com, and we have a path, which is this part or this segment that comes after your domain. A path or URL path, or the path name as we call it in Next.js, is consisting of these different segments. Segments are these sections that are separated or delimited by this /. Okay, so we have two different segments over here, and together they're creating this path. So whenever we're talking about a route segment, we're talking about one of these guys. Whenever we're talking about a URL path or the path name, we're talking about everything that comes after your domain. And then lastly, we have this first /, which is your root route or your root segment. This is what we have tried to kind of render inside of our application. If we go back to our starter kit, we see this, we're rendering the root segment or the / of our application now using this layout and page files inside the app router. Now let's talk about creating a new route in your app router. Next.js uses a file system based routing, meaning that you create routes with files and folders. Folders are used to create route segments, meaning that each folder is going to be mapped to a specific route segment, and files are used to create UI or the HTML or the actual user interface for that specific route. So for example, if I wanted to create an about page or an about route, I would create an about folder. This is going to be about segment. So this is going to create a new segment inside of our URL. And to create a UI, or what actually is going to be shown on the screen, I'm going to have to create a page.jsx inside of it. So this is going to be a React Server component that represents this page. Let's just put about for now. So if we now move to the about page, we should see that UI being rendered that is about. So as you can see here, this new about folder is mapping to this specific route segment. If I go back to our drawing board for a second and bring this down, where we can see that inside of our app folder, every other folder that we create is going to map to a specific segment inside of our URL. So the setting folder to the setting segment, the account to the account segment, and the app itself or the outermost layouts and pages that you create inside the app folder is going to be mapped to your root index or root segment. A little side note here that even though routes are defined using folders, they're not going to be publicly accessible unless you put in a page.js or route.js, as we're going to learn later on, inside of that specific segment. So this means if I go ahead and create, for example, a new folder called contact, this is going to map to a new route segment. And if I don't put anything inside of it and try to go back to our app and try to access this contact, Now this segment, even though the route has technically created this specific segment, is not publicly accessible because I don't have a file page.js or route.js inside of it. Now as soon as I create a page.js inside of it, now this becomes publicly available, and I can just put in contact over here to demonstrate this. Now as you can see, this route becomes publicly accessible because we created this page.jsx inside of that route segment. Now this is exactly what this outermost page.jsx is doing to our root segment, which is inside of this app folder, and making our home page available publicly so that we can access our home page. And this is the component that's responsible for rendering our home page that says Next.js starter kit. This is what we created together in the first lesson. Now, before talking about different files you can actually put inside of these folders, or your routes, or the different file conventions you have in the app router, let's talk about nested routes for a second. We actually saw this together when we were creating these different segments. We have a nested route, and we created this nested segment or route by just nesting folders inside one another. So for example, here, if inside of our about folder, I want to create another folder that talks about our team, and then put another page.jsx inside of it, I have now created a nested route that goes from the about to the team. So let's just call this the team. If I now save this with this page.jsx, I have now made this specific route accessible. So let's go back to our application. And if I now go to /about, I'm going to get the about page. But if I now go ahead and access the team, I'm going to get the team segment. So as easy as creating nested folders, you can create nested routes. Now, pages are React Server components by default. We're going to dive deeper into what React Server components are, how they're different with client components, when to use which later on in the lessons. But for now, from a high level, we know any page, layout, or component inside of our app folder is a React Server component by default. Now, another special file that we can use in the app router is layout.js. A layout is a shared UI that you can use across multiple pages. Now, you can define a layout by exporting a React component from a layout.jsx file. Your component should accept a children prop, which is going to be populated with child segments or child layouts if they exist. Now, by default, layouts are React Server components, but they can also be client components. Now, the outermost layout is called the root layout. This is a required file which is shared across all the pages of your application. We've seen this together briefly in the previous modules. As you can see here inside of my app folder, I have this layout which is created for me by default, built in when we ran the create next app. And here, as you can see, we have this root layout. This is a required file. It has a children prop where different pages and nested layouts, if they exist, are going to be plugged in, and it must contain the HTML and body tag. Your root layout is by default a React Server component and cannot be a client component. Other layouts, as we're going to see together in a second, can be a React Server component or a client component, but your root layout, that's the layout that lives inside, directly inside your app folder. This needs to be a server component. This is where you can modify the HTML that's returned initially from the server, and you can use this metadata API to add metadata tags. Again, you shouldn't be manipulating the head tag directly here. We're going to talk about this metadata API and how to use it later on in the chapters. But for now, we can see here that we have some global CSS, some global fonts affecting our whole HTML document, and some metadata set for our entire application. Now, as I mentioned, you can create layouts inside of your route segments as well. So this outermost one was your root layout, but you can create layouts inside of these segments too. So for example, inside of my about, if I go ahead and create a layout.jsx file, this is going to be the layout that all of the children inside of this about segment will share. The about itself, the team, and anything inside of it will then use this shared layout, which preserves state. And because it's by default a React server component, it can also fetch data. And you don't have to refetch and re-render that layout if it is shared between all of that child segments. So if I go ahead and export a React server component from this file and name it maybe about layout and save this. Now if I go back to my application, now as you can see here, the content of my layout has actually replaced the content of my page. That's why you need to put in a children prop inside of your layout. This is where your actual page or segment is going to be plugged in. So let's create a section over here, and inside of it I'm going to put an h1 to say this is coming from the about layout. And then underneath this, let's have a div where we would just render out the specific children that we have. And to set this apart, maybe we just give this a little margin top of 6. Now with that saved, as you can see here, I have that about layout text that's coming from my layout, and I do have my team over here that's coming from the actual page inside of my team. Now if I also go back to the about page, I should see something similar where I have seen this about layout and the actual content of the about page, which is coming from this guy. Now going back to the root layout, this is a place that you can maybe put in your site navigation. So you can put in a header tag, for example, over here, a nav tag, and maybe an unordered list, an li, and then maybe inside of it, we're going to put a link tag. We're just going to point to our about page. I just want to show you how you can put in a layout that is shared between all of the components and pages across your application. I'm going to put this children, which is going to be where the content of our pages or nested layouts are going to be plugged in. Maybe we're going to also export a footer. So this header and footer now are going to be shared across all the pages in our application. As you can see there, I have that about link up top. If I now navigate back to the home page, you can see I have this Next Starter homepage, and I have that about link, which is going to take me to the about page. The about page not only has that header that's coming from this link. If I just give this a little background so we can understand what's going on here. So let's just give this a background of gray 100 and maybe a little padding. So you can see up top, that's the header that's shared between all of the pages. And now when I go to the about, I get this about layout, which is that specific layout we defined in this about segment, which is now shared from that segment onwards or downwards to all the children, including this /team that also shares that specific about layout. Now there are other special files you can use inside the app router to create UIs. We covered layout and page. Now I want to talk about templates here because they're very similar to layouts in that they wrap the children and nested layouts. And the only difference between layouts and templates is that templates are actually re-rendered. So they're re-rendered layout. If you remember, we mentioned that layouts actually persist state. They don't re-render, they don't refetch the data. They just stay there. And any child segment that's actually changing on navigation is going to be rendered. Whereas in templates, if you are navigating between different routes that actually use a template, every time or on every navigation, a new instance of this template is going to be created. So therefore, the state is not preserved. It's going to actually re-render. It's going to be useful, for example, if you want to use enter and exit animations, or you're using anything that depends on your use effects or user state. It is going to resynchronize all of your events. And you shouldn't be using templates unless you have these specific needs. So use a layout because it's more optimized. It's actually going to preserve state. It's not going to pre-render, and that's the whole point of this native nested or native layouts. But if you have those specific use cases where you would want your layout to actually re-render every time that the user navigates, you can also use use a template. Just have that in mind. The rest, as I mentioned, we're going to cover in future lessons, including the suspense, the error boundaries, and API endpoints. That's a wrap for this video. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about navigating between pages using the next link component and the use router hook.